The rain came down like it meant to drown the whole county. A young woman stood on a stranger's porch at midnight, her knuckles raw from pounding on a door that belonged to a man she barely knew. In her trembling hands, she clutched a folder of legal papers, papers that would decide whether she kept everything her father had built, or lost it forever to a brother who had never once gotten his hands dirty. She had for days to do something she'd never imagined she would have to do: find a husband, or watch her father's dying wish be torn apart by greed. What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video. Comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to the Aura Fables for more unforgettable stories. 3 weeks earlier, in a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in rural Montana, Jake Harper woke before sunrise, the way he had every day since his parents passed. The house was quiet, in the particular way old houses are quiet, full of small settling sounds. Pipes ticking, wind finding gaps in window frames that had never quite closed right. He made his coffee standing up, because sitting down felt like inviting the silence to keep him company. And some mornings he did not have the patience for that kind of company. His hands were weathered from years of fence mending and cattle work, the kind of hands that told a story before a person ever opened their mouth. His flannel shirt was patched at the elbows, not because he could not afford a new one, but because throwing away something that still worked felt like a small betrayal of the values his father had raised him with. His boots were caked in mud that never seemed to fully wash away, no matter how many times he scraped them against the porch step. He had once dreamed of something bigger. There had been an acceptance letter once, tucked into a drawer he rarely opened anymore, offering him a place in an engineering program 2 states away. He remembered the weight of that envelope in his hands, how it had felt like the first door in his life that opened toward something other than cattle and fences. But his father's heart had given out that same spring, suddenly, in the doorway of the barn, and the farm needed hands more than Jake's future needed ambition. He had folded the letter, placed it in the drawer, and never spoken of it again. Grief has a way of rearranging a person's priorities without ever asking permission, and Jake had learned to carry his quietly, the way his father had taught him to carry everything, without complaint, without spectacle. A few miles down the road stood the Walker property, larger and better kept. Owned by a man named David Walker, someone the whole town had respected without needing to be told why. David had 2 children, and like most families, the land had shaped them in very different directions. His son, Grant, had left for the city years earlier, chasing a life measured in glass towers and quarterly earnings reports. A life where soil was something you avoided getting on your shoes rather than something you built a future from. Over time, Grant had come to see the family land not as an inheritance, but as an asset waiting to be liquidated, numbers on a spreadsheet, not decades of his father's labor. His daughter, Emily, was different, though not in ways anyone had bothered to notice. She had spent her 20s drifting between a college education and her father's fields, never quite certain which life was truly hers to claim. She showed up to family gatherings in tailored blazers and left wearing borrowed work boots. She loved the land in a way that had never been given room to grow, because David, worried for her safety and her future, had never fully trusted her to run it, and Grant, dismissive as ever, had certainly never bothered to ask what she wanted at all. When David passed away that spring after a long illness, the town mourned a good man, the kind whose funeral drew farmers from 3 counties over. But grief gave way quickly to fear once the will was read aloud in a small office above the local bank. David, frightened in his final months by how easily Grant spoke of selling everything to developers, had added a clause meant to protect his daughter, a clumsy, desperate attempt at protection written by a dying man who believed that a partner beside her might shield her from a brother who had already stopped seeing her as family and started seeing her as an obstacle. Instead, that single clause left Emily cornered, with days to spare and nowhere left to turn, except toward the quiet, guarded neighbor her father had always spoken of with quiet respect, Jake Harper. Emily's arrival at Jake's door that rain-soaked night was not a plea for romance. It was a plea for survival, and she made no attempt to disguise it as anything softer. She spread the damp legal papers across his kitchen table with trembling hands, the pages sticking together at the corners, ink smudged where the rain had gotten to them before she could shield them. Her voice cracked as she explained the impossible ultimatum buried inside her father's will, a condition she had not even known existed until a lawyer's office that afternoon had turned her entire future into a countdown. Grant, she explained, had already returned to the farm in a polished truck with clean shoes, speaking to the hired workers as though the land had already changed hands. He had told two of the men outright that Emily was too emotional, too soft, too unprepared to run anything larger than a garden. And the workers, uncertain who truly held authority, had simply looked down at their boots rather than argue. Jake listened in silence, the kettle behind him slowly beginning to whistle, its sound the only thing filling the space where words kept failing him. He knew men like Grant. He had watched them before. Men who looked at fertile soil and saw nothing but square footage waiting to be developed. Men who valued a 100-year-old barn only for the price its reclaimed lumber might fetch at auction. It put a hard, familiar ache in his chest, the same ache he had carried since his own father's funeral, when a stranger from a land management company had left a business card on his porch before the ground had even fully settled. Emily asked him to marry her plainly, without dressing the request in anything prettier than what it truly was, she admitted, when he asked her directly that yes, she was using him, but not cruelly, not without regard for what it might cost him. She was asking for help because she had run out of anyone else to ask, and she would not insult him by pretending otherwise. That honesty struck Jake harder than a more polished appeal ever could have. He looked around his kitchen, the same walls his mother had once painted a warm yellow, the same table where his father used to spread unpaid bills and pretend, for his son's sake, that things were not as dire as they looked. Jake understood, more deeply than Emily could have known, what it meant to be handed land before you felt ready to carry it, and what it meant to have people quietly waiting for you to fail. He agreed, but only under one condition, spoken slowly, so there would be no mistaking it. There would be no lies between them, not at his table, not under his roof. To the outside world, they would present whatever the circumstances demanded. But between the two of them, there would be nothing except the truth, however uncomfortable that truth might become. By morning, they stood before a tired-eyed judge in a courthouse that smelled faintly of old paper and fluorescent light, signing documents neither of them had ever imagined signing. There were no flowers waiting on the table, no family gathered in the aisles, no music drifting through the room. There was only rainwater drying slowly on the hood of an old pickup truck outside, and to people who barely knew each other, making a promise that the rest of the town would soon scrutinize from every direction. In the weeks that followed, Emily moved into Jake's farmhouse with 2 bags, 1 raincoat, and a cardboard box of paperwork she refused to leave unguarded, even for a single night. What began as a strained, careful silence between 2 near strangers slowly transformed into something neither of them had expected to build. Jake taught her which suppliers gave her father extra time when money ran short, and which ones smiled politely while quietly padding their invoices. He taught her to call ahead of a due date rather than wait for a supplier to call her first, because looking in control, he told her, was half the job until the day she actually felt it. Grant tested her patience again and again, arriving unannounced with developers in pressed suits to walk pastures that were no longer his to offer, mocking her in front of hired hands, telling anyone who would listen that her marriage was a desperate performance destined to collapse under its own weight. Each time, Emily's voice grew a little steadier, a little less willing to shrink beneath his words. The true test came on a wind-torn evening, when cattle broke loose through a damaged gate and scattered along a rain-slicked road. One animal wandering dangerously close to a delivery van stopped with its hazard lights blinking through the downpour. Emily worked alongside Jake, Ray, and 2 neighbors for hours in the mud and the dark, slipping, catching herself, refusing to step back, even when a spooked steer turned hard in her direction. By the time the last animal was secured behind a temporary chain, something in the yard had quietly shifted. Ray looked at her, rain dripping steadily off the brim of his hat, and told her plainly that she had done good. She straightened at those 4 words as though they carried more weight than any speech Grant had ever delivered. The final confrontation unfolded in a modest lawyer's office above the town bank. Narrow stairs creaking beneath old carpet that smelled faintly of dust and years of quiet negotiations. Grant arrived polished and certain of victory, one ankle resting on his knee, as though he already owned the outcome of the meeting. He dismissed the marriage outright as a desperate stunt, insisting that Emily had panicked, grabbed the nearest broke neighbor, and expected the world to treat the arrangement as something real. He mocked Jake too, suggesting his only true motive had been the Walker family's money. Emily did not flinch. She opened a folder twice as thick as the one she had carried to Jake's door on that first rain-soaked night. Inside were paid invoices for feed, fuel, and veterinary care. Renegotiated supplier agreements bearing her own signature. A repair schedule for the south barn roof. A signed statement from Ray and the other hired hands confirming that they recognized her, without hesitation, as the one making daily decisions on the farm. Letters from the feed store owner and 2 neighboring farms confirming that operations had continued without interruption. She did not claim to know everything about running a farm. She simply proved with evidence Grant could not talk his way around that the land was thriving under her care. The elderly lawyer removed his glasses slowly, reviewed each page in careful silence, and delivered his verdict without ceremony. The marriage satisfied the condition written into her father's will. The records demonstrated clear, active operational control. The farm would remain Emily's. Grant's confidence cracked visibly across his face, his final threats falling flat in a room that no longer had any reason to fear him. He stood so quickly his chair scraped hard against the floor, promising she would regret this, before storming out through the narrow stairwell and across a rain-puddled parking lot, his polished shoes stepping carefully around the same mud he had once mocked others for working through. Outside in the fading gold light of early evening, Emily turned to Jake and offered to release him from the arrangement now that her father's condition had finally been met. But Jake had already understood something that no legal document could ever capture. He had entered this agreement believing he was simply helping a frightened young woman save her family's land. He had not realized until that very moment that somewhere between the mud, the long mornings, and the quiet nights spent at a shared kitchen table, he had found something of his own. A home he had not known he was still looking for. In the months that followed, Emily became known throughout the county not as David Walker's uncertain daughter, but as a rancher in her own right, steady, capable, and deeply respected by every hand who worked beside her. She eked every worker Grant had once dismissed, and she made certain their wages, their safety, and their voices mattered as much as her own decisions. The farmhouse that once echoed with silence now held laughter, shared meals, and a partnership built on something far sturdier than any contract. True greatness, in the end, was never measured by inherited wealth, polished shoes, or a name on a deed. It was measured by character, by the quiet willingness to keep showing up when no one is watching, and by the courage to stand firm when the world expects you to fold. Every person carries invisible battles, hidden behind mud-streaked jeans or trembling hands on a stranger's porch. And sometimes, the people we underestimate the most are the ones who end up teaching us what it truly means to belong.